Welcome everyone to the Mashery webinar series. Today's episode, API Docs That Rock. I'm Andy Raskin, Mashery Director of Product Marketing, and I'm here with Neil Mansilla, Mashery's Director of Developer Products.
Hi everyone.
Neil's going to talk all about how to deliver great API docs and why that is really important. We'll talk for about 15-20 minutes and then turn it over to you in the audience for Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question during the webinar, you can ask it via the questions window in the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll try to get to all of them. We've got a lot of folks tuning in today. I guess this is a topic that a lot of people are interested in, especially API product management execs, platform marketing execs, of course people who create technical documentation. Neil, why don't you take it, tell us about how to create API docs that rock and why that's important.
Sure. So why do docs matter is a really big question because it's such a mundane topic, you think documentation. But if I were to ask everyone that's present, do you believe that providing great documentation matters? I have no doubt that everyone for sure would say emphatically, yes, it is. But the fact is most documentation isn't great. And in fact, it's just the opposite. They're either too sparse, they're too technical for anyone other than the person who developed the software, or they're too difficult to navigate, or the worst case is that they're just not there. So, where's the disconnect between when we say that it's very important to delivering something that is either non-existent or it just is not good? So, what ends up happening, we find, is that docs just kind of get deprioritized, right? Like shipping the software, shipping the platform. That's the most important thing, and then docs just kind of fall to the wayside.
Yeah, you sort of have like the team is really focused on building the API, and then it's sort of like, oh, we'll get that technical writer to write the docs, and it's a sort of sometimes an afterthought or something like that.
Yeah, if that even.
Yeah.
Sure. Afterthought if we're lucky. Mm-hmm. So, with Mashery, we think that great docs are part of your API strategy for many reasons, from the very start and ongoing. So today we're going to cover why docs matter, what makes them great, and why is it so tough to maintain them. Okay. So first I'm going to talk to why docs matter and why, if you read here, why we believe that I believe they're a necessary part of your platform. I'm a developer, so from a developer's perspective, right away, as anyone who's consuming your API, whether it's an internal developer or a partner, it lowers your technical support burden. If I have a question and I can self-serve it with great API documentation, I'm not calling, I'm not emailing, and that is huge. Some of the biggest developer programs out there, they spend so much time in their forums or on their telephone just trying to answer questions, the same question over and over again. So just decreasing costs. Increasing revenues. Just faster successful integrations. If I can get running with this thing immediately and feel like I can have success early, I'm going to implement it and I'm going to move forward, as opposed to not being able to do that because I don't understand what the heck is going on or how to use it. And then just in terms of prospects, so we're seeing this new trend where even some of our very, very large enterprise clients that are typically what you might consider a closed API, they're opening up some public endpoints for various reasons, and part of it is lead generation. And so by having great documentation, those partners that those potential partners you're exposing it to, it increases their confidence that this potential partner will be able to engage with your platform and be successsul with it.
So when we're talking about partners, we're actually talking often about customers or resellers or some revenue channel that's being created that's getting done faster or more successfully through a better documentation.
A partner I would categorize as anyone who consumes the API. Mm-hmm. B2B relationship, it could be, like I said, even internal use. We have a lot of clients where their only consumption is internal, but yet the investment in documentation is just as important, and they're starting to realize that.
Right, so you get your iPhone app or your iPad app out faster, more successfully. It often translates into bigger revenues, faster.
Oh, for sure.
Market,
and if we have time, I have some fantastic examples of deployments that have taken place and partnerships that have taken place strictly based on the fact that everything was self-service.
Cool.
Okay. So what makes great API docs? There's a few points here on the screen, including a getting started guide, and the assumption that some people make, that some API managers make, that the platform is already familiar to people because they eat sleep and code with the stuff every single day. It's just not true, right? Internally, for your own, even within your own company, interdepartmental projects, B2B relationships for sure, and of course with any type of external new developers or consumers of the API. A getting started guide. It seems so basic, but this is one of the things that we really recommend to all of our clients. And I'll show you some examples of this. So we'll just whiz through this list here, and I'll show you some examples of great API docs. Learning by example is very important. If any of you follow the O'Reilly book series, there have been it's gone from something that was often very technical to something that was very learned by examples, very hands-on, right? Those became the most popular books. In fact, I remember learning a couple languages that way, literally sitting inside of a Barnes & Noble and learning how to code by example. So providing sample calls and code examples is very important. Intuitive navigation. So before I actually go through this, I'm going to show some examples of some intuitive navigation and some not so intuitive navigation, if you don't mind. So typically, this is what you might consider long-form documentation. It's very flat. It looks as if it's collapsible, but it's very flat. And I could scroll on forever here. And this is an example of something that's very typical that we find with documentation. Here's a traditional Java doc type documentation, something that was probably machine generated from a doxygen or Java doc, and very technical, right? You're talking about you're looking at methods and classes here. Let's click into one of these. Probably only consumable by people that are already familiar with this to begin with. So this again is potentially something that I would warn people against doing. Whereas you have something like let's take Trulia. The navigation is quite simple. It's this is using the our documentation CMS in Mashery. So they're taking all of the components of their docs, and they're justifying it here on the right hand side by method and then inside. So back to some of the points here. Intuitive navigation, even if you're particularly if you have a simple API like Trulia has, don't make it flat. Make it very intuitive. Completeness. It almost seems like it goes without saying, but so does having just really good documentation from the onset. There are a number of examples that I won't point out here today of incomplete documentation. Features, literally parameters that are not covered in methods. And it causes nothing but mass confusion, right? And a ton of dissatisfaction. And really, at the end of the day, it's an oversight that just should never happen.
Well, it's hard to keep the docs up to date, right? Because the API changes, and then you're having to go back and update the doc. You have to remember to do that, and they're often sort of separate projects, right?
They are separate projects, which is again, even the last bullet point, maintaining accuracy and keeping it up to date. Probably one of the worst things you can do is if you're to deprecate an API call, version it off, and not document it, right? In the SOAP world, you have versioned WSDLs, where if you can read a WSDL or you throw it through a WSDL processor, you have the advantage of seeing the versions there. But in today's more RESTful API world that we're living in now, we're seeing a lot of API architects not necessarily follow that model, something that we really need to do. So why is it tough to maintain? At the very top level, it's process breaking down. Who's responsible for it, right? Regardless of the size of the team, whether it's a huge, in fact, the larger the team, probably the more difficult it is. But who's responsible for maintaining these things, right? If it's a cross-functional effort to deliver a platform, you might have one segment that is very focused on just what they do, and they may not maintain docs for another part of the platform. We actually see that with some of our clients that are very large, right? They'll have different divisions that manage different parts of the API. So who has the access to make the changes? So things just fall through the cracks. And then here's another one where the docs live separately from the API in the second bullet point here. What I mean by that is you'll see sometimes you'll see companies try to implement a wiki that's hosted somewhere else, and that's where their docs live. So it's not necessarily a part of the main developer portal. Like I guess I can only speak to what Mashery does. We keep the docs within the developer portal and we manage them there, and we can talk about that more. But it's not keeping them separate can sometimes cause a lot of pain because it's a whole different set of authentication to manage that stuff. So actually, before we move on to some of the IODocs demo, so we have this product called IODocs, which stands for Interactive Input-Output Documentation, or we kind of dubbed it Interactive Documentation here. And so I'm going to show you an example of, here's one of our clients, Newstar, and they have this thing called Newstar IP Intelligence. From a developer's perspective, a partner perspective, this API documentation is beautiful. Now, mind you, this is probably one of my favorite APIs because there's one method, and it's called IP info. It takes an IP address and it converts it to geodata. But just within that one method, look how well supported it is in terms of how well they broke out their documentation, the code samples they have for all these different languages, and then getting even to the payload formats. So even despite the fact that this is long-form documentation that's beautiful, they decided to also try out IODocs. So IODocs is something that looks like this. It's an interactive documentation tool. So here's their one method called IP info, and here's the 4.2.2.2 is just a IPv4 address.
So so Newstar IP Intelligence is you basically give it an IP address, and it gives you all kinds of location and other information about that address. Right?
Correct, most comprehensive one out there. And you hit try it, and there you go. There's the payload. So here's what the response headers look like, and here's the response body for that query. Now, what is this? This serves as essentially an example call, but it's live data. And additionally, you have to, each call here needs to be, I'll get a little geeky here, the API key and a secret needs to get signed to create the signature along with the epoch. That's the IODocs takes care of all that, right?
So that's happening, so the developer doesn't have to go in and type in their...
They don't have to calculate your MD5 signature on that stuff. So that's just one example. So we do that, do MD5, SHA-256. We do all the signature methods based on what the API requires. But just, again, the elegance and beauty of this is you see it. And anyone who is, at the first time they're exposed to, to this method, they get it immediately. And that's the key here, is that documentation is a learning tool.
So it's a mixture of the documentation and testing all in one tool, in one place.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yeah.
So the developer can kind of learn about the methods and learn about the API and make calls before they actually even start writing any code. So actually one thing I've heard is that folks are saying that it's very easy for a potential partner even to come and just evaluate the API. And as you were saying before, partners are rather than having to get some flat file or look at some big XML response, they can just come here and look and make a test call, see what kind of data they're getting back, and make a decision very quickly if they want to have a business relationship.
Absolutely. And like I said, the example I mentioned about an enterprise company that is opening up some public endpoints is Dun & Bradstreet, right? DNB Direct. That's just another example of, and they're utilizing IODocs that same way so that their potential partners can take a look at their offering without necessarily compromising the value of their data. And they can essentially get rolling and get code ready before they even sign up and start paying Dun & Bradstreet. So here's another example, Edmunds.com. Great documentation in terms of delivering examples, response formats, all the data, all the things that as a consumer of the API I would need in order to get started and to understand this. They also have implemented interactive IODocs. So instead I can just, I can navigate, and this is the method. These are the parameters. It's so simple. And just to give, this is a trend that we started noticing in 2011. So I'm going to show you, like WordNik. They're a dictionary platform. This is their default documentation. Okay.
It's beautiful.
It is really nice, and this obviously serves as an inspiration to a lot of new documentation. So these are the default docs. So let me actually show you how this is put together. So on our we have this test portal here, and here's an IODocs deployment for this Acme catalog. And how is all of this put together? So we have our own definitional schema for IODocs, and it looks something like this. And it's a basic JSON schema that describes the API, the version, title, and so on and so forth. But to take it down to the nitty-gritty, here are the resources, here are the methods, and the parameters. Very, very simple in terms of enumerated values here. Where the parameters are placed.
If you define your API in this JSON format, then IODocs can show it.
Yeah, and what's neat about it is that you don't have to necessarily expose all of your endpoints and resources here, right? You can be very selective, right? And with with role-based access control, we'll be able to do even really cool things in terms of who can see what. It's pretty interesting. So this is actually this data here that you're looking at is placed into it's a native object within the Mashery developer portal. So when you have IODocs on here, all of this gets rendered by something that you configure right within the Mashery solution. So this, back to the whole decoupling thing, not only is long-form documentation, content management system part of our solution, but IODocs in this, configuring IODocs is also. So it's not these two separate things. You maintain them all in the same place.
So I think what you're saying is, so let's say an API provider makes some changes to their API. Well, their docs, if they're using IODocs, would stop working. So it's like kind of a check on whether you have it up to date. So it almost becomes part of the same project to updating the API. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. Well, the fact that to the earlier point about maintaining API docs and why it's difficult, because it serves as a code sample, a live code sample, and it is making live calls against your existing version, your production version, or your sandbox version for that matter. It delivers exactly accurate data. So the whole idea of maintainability and accuracy is addressed by this. So just as a side, over on developer.mashery.com, which is the Mashery API network for our single sign-on, if you were to go to developer.mashery.com/iodocs, we've kind of meshed this into some kind of a conglomeration of many different platforms. And so you can take a look and see USA Today's Articles API. Oh, and by the way, if you're, again, that whole decoupling thing, if you're signed in with your Mashery ID, your keys automatically get populated here. So you don't have to memorize your API key. So I'll just make an example call here. I already did one. And this is all within developer.mashery.com. Of course, you can go to developer.usatoday.com and check it out for yourself.
And so what does it take for, what does it cost for a Mashery to get Mashery IODocs? Is that?
Well, I mean, it's part of the offering. There's no additional cost for our clients. Yeah.
So, Neil, what do you see as? I mean, this is obviously a huge step forward from sort of traditional long form documentation. What do you see? Where do you see things going in the future after this?
Sure. I don't see long form documentation going away. Actually. I think that it's going to be a hybrid of the two. So I think a neat example of that is, let's go like Sencha. If you guys are familiar with Sencha, they have this combination of long-form documentation formatting with, with what I call with a more modern view. So if you were to hit F1 in Windows, you'd see some type of navigational component like this. But they have code samples here. Guides and sample apps. This is almost like a documentation app. This is where I kind of see things heading. They're meeting the needs of partners and or developers to consume as quickly as possible and understand and succeed.
Okay. So we've just hit the time for the Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, remember you can use the questions window in your GoToWebinar control panel to ask that. We've got a few already, so I'll start with the first one. So Neil, you mentioned that it's often not clear in an organization who should be responsible for documentation. It sort of often gets pushed off on some technical writer or something like that.
Sure.
Where do you see it living? Who should be the person or the role that that is responsible for great docs?
If you have a technical writer on staff, no question it should be them, right? It's just that we're seeing that the velocity in terms of revs on APIs or methods, it's so fast, and some of the organizations we work with are so large. It's really about the coordination and process that's most important. So if you have a technical writer, that's the person. If you don't have one, you just need to put in a process that really gets everyone who touches the API to be a part of that process.
Another question we just got is IODocs also available as an open source project?
Yeah, it is. And you can grab it on github.com/Mashery/IODocs. And we have open sourced it. It's written in Node.js, and we've already seen some pretty neat implementations of it. People have contributed back and made it even better, and we love that. And so, we have non-customers using it and contributing back, and it's wonderful. Companies like SendGrid, DataSift even has it in places, in HubSpot.
Actually, then we just got another question, which is what other companies are using IODocs? I know that you may have USA Today, you said D&B, Dun & Bradstreet, Hoover's D&B Direct.
Sure, Clout, Rotten Tomatoes, Hotwire. Yeah, these are clients, by the way. Let's see, USA Today, as I mentioned.
Edmunds.
Edmunds is, yeah.
FanFeeder, I believe, is right.
FanFeeder. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a pretty big list, actually, people that are starting to use it, yeah.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for questions and for the webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Neil.